Hi Reddit, I'm Sebastian, 40M. I never thought I'd be writing about something that feels so surreal, but here we are. This story involves my family, a wedding, and the kind of public humiliation that leaves you questioning everything. A little background first. My Aunt Muriel has always been a controlling, entitled presence in our family. She treats everything like a performance, from holidays to birthdays, and if anyone doesn't follow her script, they're an inconvenience or a joke. Her son, Ezra, my cousin, is the center of her universe. He's loud, spoiled, and quick to follow her lead, especially if it means putting someone down. Me, apparently, I've always been the shadow. The background character she can openly mock while keeping her own reputation intact. Months ago, I got an invitation to Ezra's wedding. Normally, I wouldn't have gone. I've been careful to avoid family drama for years, but my mom insisted it would be polite. She said it might be a chance to soften the tension, though I knew better. Still, I thought, maybe showing up quietly and not giving them material would be enough. The hall was beautiful. Chandeliers glinted off polished floors, tables were set perfectly, and the floral arrangements were carefully coordinated. I tried to slip in unnoticed, dressed in a dark suit, holding only the small gift I had picked out in advance. But as soon as Muriel saw me, she stiffened. That sharp, calculated smile she wears came out almost immediately. "You're just the help, not a guest," she said. Her voice was low, sharp, and meant to carry just enough for the tables around her to hear. My stomach dropped. I paused, unsure if she was joking, but the look in her eyes left no doubt. Ezra chuckled beside her, a sound designed to humiliate rather than amuse. "Bet he took the bus here," he added, loud enough for several people to turn and glance at me. Laughter rippled through the nearby tables. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was here to be polite, not to engage. But every step toward my seat felt like walking across a tightrope. Muriel didn't stop there. She kept leaning over Ezra, whispering, while shooting glances at me that could have frozen water. It was one of those moments where you can feel everyone in the room noticing, even if no one says anything. People always notice when your family makes you the target, but they rarely intervene. My uncle, my mom's brother, pretended to be absorbed in conversation, eyes flicking nervously toward the scene, but never speaking up. I finally found a corner table, hoping to disappear into the crowd. I wanted nothing more than to sit quietly and avoid attention. That's when I noticed the groom's father, Mr. Clifton, sitting at the table directly across the room. He had a calm, observant demeanor, the kind of person who notices details most people miss. And he was staring at his phone, swiping and tapping like he didn't want anyone to see what he was looking at. Then it happened. His eyes went wide. He froze, mid-scroll, staring at the screen like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The air around him seemed to shift. For a moment, the room's energy changed without a word being spoken. Even Muriel's laughter faltered. Ezra's grin disappeared, replaced by something tighter and more anxious. No one knew what had happened yet, and I had no idea either. I stayed where I was, frozen, watching as Mr. Clifton's reaction rippled outward. He set his phone down slowly, almost cautiously, and scanned the room. And that's when it hit me. Whatever he had seen, it was related to me. I could feel the tension coil around my aunt and cousin. Muriel's carefully constructed world, the one where she controlled perception, reputation, and power within the family, was starting to crack. Ezra's panic was subtle at first, but unmistakable. I realized that this moment, small as it seemed, was the beginning of a shift. I wasn't invisible anymore. I tried to focus on my own breathing, steadying myself, but I couldn't ignore the way the tables around us had grown quieter. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. People who had been laughing at my expense were suddenly unsure where to look. My aunt's jaw tightened. She leaned closer to Ezra, whispering rapidly, likely trying to reassert control, but I could tell her words weren't landing the way she wanted. The rest of the evening was poised on a knife edge. Every laugh, every murmur of conversation felt loaded now. I could feel the tension building, the kind that precedes a confrontation you know is inevitable but can't predict fully. And in the back of my mind, a single thought kept repeating. The tables were about to turn, and I had no idea how far it would go, but I was finally going to see them falter. I tried to focus on the hors d'oeuvres in front of me, picking at a few tiny sandwiches I barely wanted, but my mind kept drifting back to Mr. Clifton. I couldn't shake the way his gaze had locked on me earlier, that look of surprise and calculation. The room hadn't returned to normal either. I noticed people whispering, throwing subtle glances at my direction, as if the invisible currents of family hierarchy had suddenly shifted and everyone was unsure where they stood. Muriel wasn't handling it well. She had always relied on control and intimidation, but for the first time that night, it seemed like she was fumbling. I caught her glancing over at Mr. Clifton repeatedly, each time with her brow furrowed, jaw tight. Ezra mirrored her panic, fidgeting in his chair and muttering under his breath. I wasn't close enough to hear exactly what he was saying, but his voice had that shaky, desperate edge that comes when you realize the consequences of your actions might be closer than you thought. Then came the speeches. Typically, this is the part of a wedding where everyone smiles politely, claps, and nods along. But tonight, the energy in the hall was off. When the best man got up, a man I barely knew, he began recounting stories of Ezra's childhood, and somehow, the details began to cast my cousin in a less flattering light. There were moments where people chuckled at what was being said, but they weren't laughing at me. They were laughing at the cracks beginning to appear in Ezra's carefully curated image. I saw it in Muriel's tightening grip on her clutch, in the subtle roll of her eyes, and in the way Ezra kept shifting in his seat like he wanted to disappear. After the speeches, the photographer started rounding people up for group pictures. My aunt had her usual plan. Force me into the background, keep me in a corner where I was barely visible. I allowed it at first, following directions silently, smiling politely while her eyes darted around, checking that no one noticed me out of line. But then something unexpected happened. Mr. Clifton, the groom's father, began walking purposefully toward me. My heart skipped a beat. Was he going to confront me? Had he already spoken to Muriel about whatever he saw? I kept my posture calm, pretending to adjust my tie and give off an air of casual composure, though inside I was a bundle of nerves. Sebastian, isn't it? His voice was calm, deliberate, almost neutral, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. I nodded. Would you mind stepping aside with me for a moment? I followed him a few steps away from the crowd, glancing back at Muriel. She had noticed immediately. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see Ezra stiffen next to her, watching us with a kind of frantic curiosity. What they didn't know, what no one seemed to realize, was that Mr. Clifton's attention wasn't just a random act of politeness. He'd discovered something that had the potential to undermine the entire narrative Muriel had built around her family. Are you okay? I asked him quietly, unsure if I should be concerned or defensive. He shook his head slightly, still staring at his phone as if confirming what he had already seen. I'm surprised. I didn't expect this, he said, finally looking up at me. But now I understand a lot more than I did before. I didn't respond, because honestly, I didn't understand either. I had done nothing publicly wrong tonight, nothing that should have caused anyone to notice me beyond the usual family tension. But I could see that the gears in Mr. Clifton's head were turning, that whatever he had just uncovered put him in a position of observation and, perhaps, judgment. Back at the tables, Muriel was making small motions, whispering to Ezra, pointing subtly at me as if to communicate some private strategy. I noticed the panic in her gestures, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to regain control. For the first time, her composure seemed fragile. She was always so good at controlling perception, but tonight, the illusion was cracking. The dinner itself proceeded with awkward civility. Every toast, every clink of glass, seemed to echo in my ears. My aunt and cousin were visibly tense, whispering to each other between courses, occasionally shooting subtle glances toward Mr. Clifton and me. It was almost cinematic. The villainous duo, realizing the tables might be turning in ways they could not anticipate. And then came the moment that truly escalated everything. A server brought out dessert, a delicate chocolate tart with raspberry garnish, and as they set it down, Ezra's phone buzzed. He glanced at it quickly, then paled. Muriel noticed immediately, leaning over to catch a glimpse. Her face fell in a way that made her usual mask of superiority disappear entirely. Ezra's hands began to tremble slightly as he held the device, and I could hear a faint mutter. No, this can't be happening. The room began to sense the tension. Conversations around us slowed, people leaning slightly toward each other, trying to see what had caused this shift. The once light-hearted atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a sort of expectant silence, like the moment before a storm breaks. I didn't know what exactly Ezra had seen on his phone or what had triggered Muriel's sudden panic. But I realized in that instant that something very large was about to happen. And I also realized, perhaps with a strange mix of apprehension and satisfaction, that I was no longer just the background character in their family drama. I was about to become a central figure. Then, as if to punctuate the shift, Mr. Clifton's eyes flicked toward me again. That calm, calculating gaze that had unnerved me earlier now carried a sense of purpose, as if he had pieced together a puzzle and was deciding exactly how to act on it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was just the beginning. The air in the hall was thick with quiet anticipation. The guests, for the first time that night, weren't just watching Ezra and Muriel. They were watching me, though they didn't yet know why. I felt a strange mix of dread and clarity. I wasn't sure what was coming next, but I could feel the tide turning in my favor. After the dessert incident, Ezra kept glancing at his phone, his face an open mask of disbelief and panic. Muriel, sensing the gravity of the moment, leaned close to him, her whispers quick and urgent, though I couldn't hear the words. Her hands were trembling slightly, a rare crack in her otherwise impeccable composure. I realized then that she had always relied on controlling perception. Her power wasn't in her wealth or position, but in the fear and doubt she planted in others. And for the first time, I could see that doubt reflected back on her. I needed to act carefully. This wasn't a moment for confrontation. It was a moment for observation, for understanding what leverage I now held. I had come into this wedding expecting humiliation, but instead, I found an opening, a way to turn their own arrogance against them. I noticed that the whispers had started to spread across the room. Guests who had been laughing at my expense earlier now leaned toward one another, eyebrows raised, glancing in our direction. Muriel noticed too. Her eyes flicked toward me repeatedly, calculating, trying to anticipate what might happen next. I could see the gears turning in her mind, the panic that comes when someone realizes they no longer control the narrative. Ezra, meanwhile, had moved away from the table, retreating to a corner, his phone clutched like a lifeline. I suspected he was checking some kind of message, maybe from the photographer, maybe from a family friend, but whatever it was, it had thrown him completely off balance. I had spent enough years around him and Muriel to recognize the signs: fear, defensiveness, and the beginnings of desperation. I made my move subtly. I stood and approached the edge of the room, pretending to stretch my legs, but really positioning myself to be seen. I could feel eyes following me, the guests, my aunt, my cousin. Even Mr. Clifton watched with quiet attention. I waited until Muriel looked away, then I allowed my gaze to settle briefly on Ezra. The look I gave him was calm, measured, confident. It wasn't a glare or a threat. It was a quiet signal that I knew more than he imagined, and that I was no longer afraid of him or his mother. The next part of the evening continued with the formalities, but everything had shifted. The toasts, once casual and humorous, carried an undercurrent of tension. The photographers tried to keep the smiles genuine, but they caught the subtle cracks in Muriel's and Ezra's masks. I could see her adjusting her posture constantly, forcing smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Ezra kept glancing at his phone again and again, muttering under his breath, shaking slightly each time he read something. It wasn't until the dancing began that the real opportunity appeared. Muriel had planned a grand entrance for her son and his new wife, complete with a choreographed dance that was meant to impress everyone and reinforce her control over the narrative. But Ezra's focus was broken. He stepped onto the dance floor late, tripping slightly over his own feet, eyes darting toward me mid-motion. Muriel's hands tightened on the edge of her dress, and I could see her jaw set in frustration. The once perfect performance faltered, and the room noticed. Whispers started, polite at first, then louder as the small mistakes became more obvious. I knew I had to push carefully. I didn't need to act recklessly. The situation was already spiraling in my favor. I moved closer to the edge of the dance floor, chatting casually with one of the servers, making sure to be visible but not intrusive. I let my gaze drift toward Muriel and Ezra, letting them notice it without breaking my calm. It was subtle, but I could see the panic in their eyes deepen. Then it happened. Mr. Clifton rose from his seat and approached their table. The hall fell quieter instantly. Everyone could feel the tension, though no one knew why. Muriel's lips parted as if to speak, but he didn't wait. He held out his phone, showing them something that caused Ezra to stagger slightly backward, almost losing his balance. Muriel's hands flew to her mouth, and I could see her mind working frantically, trying to figure out how to reclaim control. I didn't need to see the message. The look on their faces told me everything. Whatever Mr. Clifton had discovered completely undermined their carefully constructed world. I felt a pulse of satisfaction, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't about gloating. It was about understanding the leverage I now had. The guests were whispering now, their curiosity growing. Muriel tried to regain composure, but her movements were jerky, her usual grace gone. Ezra's hands trembled slightly as he fiddled with his cufflinks, looking helpless. And all the while, I stayed visible, calm, confident, letting them know that I was fully aware of the shift that had occurred. By the time the couple returned to their table, the room had changed. The once adoring crowd now had a subtle tension in their posture. I noticed people sneaking glances at Ezra and Muriel, trying to understand the sudden fragility in their demeanor. I could hear snippets of conversations as guests whispered among themselves. "I can't believe he would." Or, "Did you see her reaction?" I realized then that the night had become mine as much as it had been theirs. I wasn't just a passive observer anymore. Their arrogance, their cruelty, their entitlement, it had all set the stage for me to finally step out of the shadows and assert a position they hadn't anticipated. And then, in a move that sealed the shift entirely, I saw Ezra fumble once more with his phone. This time, he glanced up at me directly, eyes wide and unsteady. Muriel noticed, too, her face paling as she realized that whatever she had tried to control had slipped completely beyond her reach. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was trying to salvage the situation, to find a way to reassert her dominance, but it was too late. The first cracks had become a chasm. At that moment, I knew the next moves would be critical. I had a choice: wait and let events unfold naturally, or start orchestrating the next step of my revenge. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of power, the rare clarity of knowing that the tables had turned, and that the consequences they had always inflicted on others were now fully in their path. I stayed where I was, calm, patient, letting the tension build, waiting for the perfect moment to act. And as the music played and the guests whispered, I could see Muriel's shoulders stiffen, Ezra's panic deepen, and Mr. Clifton's eyes fixed on me with quiet calculation. I knew that whatever happened next would change the night, and possibly our family, forever. I waited, letting the tension build deliberately, aware of every eye in the hall. Every whispered conversation slowed as people instinctively leaned closer, sensing that something was off, but not yet understanding what. Muriel was practically vibrating in place, her entire body rigid as she leaned over to Ezra, whispering so furiously I could almost see her panic. Her hands clutched his arm, her eyes darting to me, trying to gauge my expression as if my calmness was a threat to her control. She murmured so quickly that I couldn't catch the words, but the desperation was evident. She was attempting to spin a narrative, to manipulate the room, to reclaim the authority that was slipping from her grasp, and she was failing. Ezra's phone buzzed again, violently vibrating against the table. He fumbled for it, knocking a glass slightly, eyes darting toward me. Panic etched every line of his face. The smug confidence he usually wore like armor had been stripped away, replaced with raw, nervous uncertainty. Every movement he made seemed overcalculated, yet clumsy, betraying the fact that he had no idea how to regain control. Finally, Mr. Clifton broke the tension, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that sliced through the murmurs like a knife. "Ezra, Muriel," he said, his tone deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial in its gravity. "I think you need to explain this." He held his phone aloft, tilting it just enough so that the table, and the slowly shifting attention of the hall, could see. The device displayed a series of messages, emails, and documents I had carefully compiled and sent months ago to a trusted family friend. They were detailed, unflinching records of every manipulation, every lie, every petty humiliation that Muriel and Ezra had inflicted on me over the years. Every insult, every attempt to undermine my career, every time they stole credit for my work, every financial trick Muriel had used under the guise of helping Ezra, it was all there. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Even the servers froze mid-step, trays hovering in the air, as the weight of what was happening hit them. The polite chatter, the subtle hum of music, the background noise of cutlery, all ceased, leaving an almost tangible silence. Muriel's face went pale. The carefully cultivated mask of composure she wore so effortlessly shattered in an instant, revealing the raw panic underneath. Ezra's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like he was struggling to find words that could fix what had already been exposed. It's not what it looks like, Muriel stammered, her usual confidence evaporating. Her hands trembled as she tried to cover the phone, to grab it, to somehow wrest control of the moment. But Mr. Clifton held it steady, unwavering, like a judge delivering a verdict. Actually, Mr. Clifton said evenly, almost gently, it's exactly what it looks like. And I think the people here deserve to know the truth before the evening continues. Gasps rippled across the room, rising into audible murmurs. Guests leaned forward, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the screen. The same people who had been laughing at me earlier now had their attention fixed squarely on the true culprits of the night. Whispers escalated, curiosity and judgment intertwining as everyone processed the weight of the revelation. Muriel, desperate to regain control, leaned toward me, her voice sharp but fragile. Sebastian, this is ridiculous. You don't understand. These are private family matters. The tremor in her voice betrayed her, making her words sound hollow and defensive rather than commanding. I understand perfectly, I said, my voice calm but carrying over the murmurs, deliberate and steady. I understand that for years you have humiliated, manipulated, and belittled me. And tonight, you are finally facing the consequences in front of everyone who matters. Ezra's face flushed deep crimson, not with anger, but with shame, panic, and disbelief. Mom, please, he whispered, barely audible, but it was too late. The room had already sensed the shift. His usual charisma, the charm that had let him skate through so many social situations, had no effect tonight. Whispers broke into conversations, cautious at first, then more direct. Guests who had laughed at me were now leaning toward each other, eyes darting between Muriel, Ezra, and me. The family's long-standing dynamic, the entitlement, the manipulative perfection, the unchallenged authority, was crumbling visibly in front of everyone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a spectacle. I let the evidence speak for itself. I could see it in Muriel's eyes. The composed veneer she wore for decades was shattered, replaced with raw panic and disbelief. Ezra sank further into his chair, defeated, eyes fixed firmly on the floor. They were both trapped by their own hubris, unable to conjure excuses or manipulation that could work in a room full of witnesses. Then came the final stroke. Mr. Clifton turned his gaze toward me with a quiet nod, as if acknowledging my part in this unveiling, then addressed the room. I think it's clear who has been behaving with integrity tonight, he said slowly, each word deliberate, and who has spent years undermining the people around them. It's remarkable what power honesty can reveal. The room's energy had shifted completely. Muriel and Ezra were no longer the center of attention. The guests avoided their eyes, glances laced with judgment and curiosity. The staff, who had once been indifferent toward me, now offered subtle, supportive smiles. Conversations around me were calm, respectful, tinged with a shared understanding of what had just been revealed. I remained seated, poised, collected, the calm eye of a storm I had quietly helped create. Muriel attempted to whisper instructions to Ezra, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. He was grappling with the shame of being exposed, and she had no control over him, no power left to manipulate the situation. By the end of the night, the damage was complete. Muriel and Ezra left early, making excuses about headaches and feeling overwhelmed, but no one believed them. Their reputation, carefully constructed over decades, had been dismantled in front of those who mattered most: family, friends, and witnesses to their cruelty. I walked out quietly at the end of the night, satisfaction calm and steady. I didn't revel in their suffering. I simply acknowledged it. For the first time in years, I was no longer the shadow, the target, the punchline. I had taken control, revealed the truth, and unmasked the villains of the family story. Weeks later, the aftermath was clear. Muriel's invitations to family gatherings dwindled. Ezra's social circle began to quietly distance themselves. Even distant relatives, once allies of convenience, kept their distance. And I remained connected to the few people who truly mattered, those who had always respected me, quietly and consistently. For the first time in years, the weight I had carried lifted. That wedding had been a turning point. The humiliation I had endured was replaced by quiet justice. Miriel and Ezra's pride had been shattered, their control stripped away, and the world could no longer view them as untouchable. I had finally gained the closure I had long been denied. The villains of my family were exposed, their arrogance laid bare, and I emerged unscathed. No apologies, no forgiveness, only the quiet, undeniable triumph of truth. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.